Greetings! Shabbat Shalom. If you're listening to this soon after it's recorded, we're in March, on the 9th day of March of 2019, and it's the second day of the month of Adar, Sheni. This is an intercalary year, so this is the second Adar. Mishenichnas Adar marbim b'simcha. When the month of Adar enters, our joy increases. It's less than 2 weeks to Purim. And Purim is not a commanded festival on the church. Jews should keep Purim. Church members are not commanded to do so. However, I would recommend that in around the time of the full moon of this month, that you go ahead and read the book of Esther and get with the historical events that occurred at this time of the year. If you do that, you'll see what went on between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. Ezra 6 ends around 516 BC. Ezra 7 takes it up around 457. And between that time, we have the reign of Xerxes I, Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus. However you want to pronounce his name in English, Ahasuerus. He rules from 486 to 465. And during his reign, we have the events of the book of Esther between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. Today I want to talk about Esther, Mordecai, and motivation. Esther, Mordecai, and motivation. And actually I'm going to begin, let me begin where I have the Bible open. I have the Bible open to Matthew 24. I remember many years ago I was at a place called Camp River Glen, and it was summertime. And I was about to talk about the book of Lamentations. But I said, let's turn to Matthew 24. And one fellow there got really excited. He's a minister now, and I guess he's really into prophecy. But he got all excited when I said, let's turn to Matthew 24. But I wasn't turning there to give a dissertation on the Olivet prophecy. I was turning to the verses I'm going to read now. Matthew 24:44. By the way, while you're turning there, remember, spring ahead, fall back. So right now, many people, not you Arizonans, you're smart enough to keep the clock the same all year. But most of us are going to have to push the clock ahead tonight. Or, in the wee hours of the morning, depending how you look at it. Matthew 24:44. I'm going to go to the 45th verse. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom his master made ruler over his household, to give them food in due season? Blessed, this is verse 46, blessed is that servant whom his master, when he comes, will find so doing. And so I told them then, since it was midsummer, it was time to study Lamentations. And since now we're coming to the end of winter, it's the season for the book of Esther. I want to go to 1 John, the 3rd chapter. This month, when we get to about the middle of the month on the sacred calendar, we're a month before the days of unleavened bread. We're a month before the New Testament Passover, the Lord's Supper. And it is a time for introspection and to get back in shape spiritually. And this study of the book of Esther a month beforehand will help motivate us to do that. But of course, the greatest motivation is the future that God has in store for us. We want to be there. I want to be there. I want you to be there. 1 John 3. I'm going to go to the second verse. Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not yet been revealed what we shall be. But we know that when he is revealed, we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Wow. We will be spirit. We will have an interaction with Jesus Christ. We'll have an interaction ultimately, of course, in a very intimate way with God the Father. And everyone who has this hope in him purifies himself just as he is pure. We want to be more and more godly because that's our destiny, to be children of God, with all that implies, which is more than we could imagine. Certainly that's a motivator. But beyond that, one of the great motivations of wanting to be godly is because ultimately God is the winner. Anything other than God's in God or God's way of life, God's plan, are losers. We want to stick with the winner. I want to I want to talk about the way the Bible is organized. And there's a lot of material that I'm going to cover in a condensed form, so you can be like the Bereans, the Jews in Berea, who searched the synagogue there, who searched the scriptures whether these things be so. Or you can look at earlier talks that I've given on the subject, or you can encourage me to cover more of the subject later on. But I do want to talk about the design and development of the Holy Scriptures, as well as, all of the Holy Scriptures, including the New Testament, the Tanakh and the New Testament. I want to say, first of all, that if you look at the Bible, you can find 7 parts, which makes sense. You have the law, the prophets, and the writings. Then in the New Testament, you have the Gospels and Acts, the Pentateuch of the New Testament, like the Torah, like the Chumash, the Pentateuch of the Old Testament. And then you have the Pauline epistles, and then you have the general epistles, and then you have Revelation. So you have 4 parts, so you have 7 altogether. And actually, you can break down the Bible further into 12 parts, and that makes sense too. The New Testament can be broken down into 5 parts if you look at Acts separately, which can be done, because John interrupts between Luke and Acts. So you have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, then you have Acts. So you can look at 5 parts of the New Testament if you look at Acts as a separate part. And then you would have 7 parts of the Old Testament as the 3 expand into 7. And let's take a look at that. You have, of course, the 5 books of the law, the 5 books of Moses. But then you have another part of the Bible, which is the former prophets. And I'll go into those in a moment. Then you have the latter prophets, but the latter prophets are major and minor. There are 3 big books and then 12 smaller books of what that we often call the minor prophets. So you have the law, the former prophets, and the major prophets, and the latter prophets rather, which are divided into the major and minor. Okay, then you have the poetical and wisdom literature, the poetic and wisdom literature. And then you have the 5 festival scrolls, and then you have the latter restoration books. So that's 7 parts of the Old Testament. I want to go into that a little further. If you organize the books ideally, you have 22 Old Testament books, 27 New Testament books, 49 altogether, 7 times 7. Now, the 27 books of the Old Testament are obvious. The 22 books of the New Testament are organized in this fashion. You have the 5 books of the law. Then you have Joshua and Judges as one long account of pre-monarchic Israel. Then the history is completed with the 7th book, which is 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. Okay? In other words, it begins with 1st Samuel, then goes to what we call 2nd Samuel often, and 1st and 2nd Kings. But you can also call it 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings. It describes Israel under the monarchy. Then we have the former prophets, we have the major prophets. The former prophets I've already talked about. The former prophets represents the history of Israel before you have the prophecies of the future. Prophecy is history written in advance. So first we have the early history, then we have the history, projecting into the future. So we have the major prophets. So we have the law, we have Joshua, we have the 5 books of the law. We have Joshua and Judges as one book. We have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Kings as one book. Okay. Then we have the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. All right. We have Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. Then we have the 12. They're put together as one book, the Trei Asar, the 12. So that we have the minor prophets. Now that comes out to 11 books. But there are 11 more, and they're in the 3rd section, the writings. That is the bridge from the Old Testament to the New. So we have in among those books, we have Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. And then we have the 5 festival scrolls. We have the 5 festival scrolls: the Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. Okay, so Esther is the 19th of the books, the way I'm counting them, right? Because we had 11 books, then we had Psalms, Proverbs, Job, and the 5, and then that made 14, and then 5 more makes 19. But there are 3 more. We have Daniel, who is considered in the writings in the Hebrew Bible, and then we have Ezra, Nehemiah as one long book, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles as one long book. So we have 22. Are you with me on that? Esther was the 19th. Then you had Daniel, you had Ezra, Nehemiah, and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So that completes your 22, 27 of the New Testament, 49 altogether. I hope you're all still with me. Now, the way the Bible is organized is the way I talked about it in the beginning. Food in due season. There are seasonal readings. You can read any part of the Bible, of course, at any time, but there are seasonally oriented readings. And if you look at the Bible, you could organize it in terms of 5 seasons. God shows his love in the Bible in multiples of 5. So let's take a look at 5 seasons. You begin with the spring, and so you have Genesis, and going through the around chapter 15 through around chapter 15 of Exodus. That's the spring section, you could say. Then you have the rest of Exodus, which is the late spring section. So the first part is connected to the days of unleavened bread. The next is connected to Pentecost. Then you have, after the late spring, you have the summer, and then that's the Leviticus, the sacrificial system. And the temple was destroyed. Both temples were destroyed in midsummer. You have the sacrificial system covered in the book of Leviticus. Then you have the 4th book, the Numbers, when Israel gathers together in the wilderness in camps. And this is what happens at the Festival of Tabernacles, particularly. It's the culmination of the pilgrimage festivals. It's the final 8 days of the festivals of the year. It's a time to grow in wisdom, to gather together and learn of God's ways. So we have the book of Numbers connects with that. And then Deuteronomy is the wrap-up, and they're about to enter the promised land, and that ties in with the winter season, with the wrap-up of the ecclesiastical year. Now that parallel can be found in the other books of the Old Testament outside of the festival scrolls. You have, corresponding with Genesis, you have the history of Israel, which I talked about. Then corresponding to Exodus, you have the major prophets talking about God's covenant. Then corresponding to Leviticus, you have the minor prophets, which talk about the rebuilding of the destroyed temple. And there's a focus. Some of those books are written by Levites. We have Malachi, which talks a lot about Levites. I don't know if Malachi was a Levite, but Levites are talked about a lot there. Zechariah was a priest. Haggai talks a lot about the temple, etc. Then you have the wisdom books, Proverbs and Job. And remember, the Feast of Tabernacles is a time when you live in a temporary dwelling, and you're reminded that this life is not really where it's at. This is temporary. We're looking to the future, and that's what really Proverbs and Job focuses on. And then finally, we have the latter restoration books, which speak of the final restoration of God's people anciently, and points to this ultimate victory that will occur later on. So are you still with me? That ties in with the winter season and with Purim in a way. So you're still with me. Now I want to talk about the New Testament from that point of view, the 5 sections. You have the Gospels, which very much relates to the Passover season. You have the book of Acts, which very much relates to Pentecost. Then you have the Pauline epistles, and I include Hebrews in there, whether or not Paul wrote them, but they're in the same style as the Pauline epistles. And there's a great focus on those epistles of Jesus Christ as our sacrifice and the significance of the temple, spiritually speaking. Then you have the wisdom books of the New Testament, the general epistles. If you look at James, it's very much like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Then we have the book of Revelation, which is the final wrap-up. Are you still with me? Now I focus on the festival scrolls. The 5 Megillot, the 5 festival scrolls. So now we come to the spring of the year, and we have the Song of Solomon. Spring is, maybe a lot of you are thinking about spring training, but spring is also the time of romance. And so the Song of Solomon, Shir HaShirim, it's read during the days of unleavened bread by the Jewish community. And then we have Ruth, which is read on Pentecost. And Ruth speaks of the conversion of Ruth and her marriage to Boaz. And the Messiah comes from that line. So the focus is on God's covenant and the conversion of humanity. The season there, that's, if you look at the references there, it ties in with Pentecost. Then you have you get to midsummer. So you went spring, late spring, you get to midsummer, you come to Lamentations. And the first and second temple were destroyed at that time of the year. So you have the book of Lamentations. And so the Jews read a book of Ruth on Pentecost, and they read the book of Lamentations on the fast of the 9th of Ab, the 9th day of the 5th month, or the 10th day of the 5th month. The 10th day of the 5th month sometimes is observed. The destruction occurred between the 7th and the 10th. Now we go into the autumn. We go into the autumn of the year. And now we have, of course, the book of Ecclesiastes, which talks about gathering together. That's what Ecclesiastes talks about. It's the assembler, Kohelet. And it's people gather together for the final, festival season and to learn to become wiser, and to realize the vanity of this life as we live in temporary dwellings. And then finally, we come to the conclusion of the ecclesiastical year. We come to the last month of the year, and that is the book of Esther. We come to the book of Esther. And the book of Esther, as I said, is a motivational text, because here we see the situation of the church through history. And we are vulnerable. We're a minority. We know that the New Testament says that if you try to live godly, in Jesus Christ, persecution comes your way. And yet and we're told also that we're a minority in the world. It's not for us to try to run the world now. It's for us to be a witness to the world. We are a counterculture, as I covered in a morning talk I gave last week. So, and yet at the same time, we understand, as I read earlier, that ultimately our destiny is to be the children of God and to rule the universe. And so we know that ultimately, we are the winners. God is a winner, and if we are on God's side, we're the winners. I think there's a story that is told about Lincoln, and people said to him, it's important to have God on our side. And Lincoln said, it's the most important thing is that we are on God's side. So let's go to the book of Esther. As I said, in a couple of weeks, they'll be reading the book of Esther in the synagogues around the world. And in your translations, you'll probably find it in the historical section and the last of the historical books. As I said, it's a little bit out of order in that sense because it's between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7. But let's go to Esther, the 8th chapter. And we have here a complete reversal of fortunes, which is what's going to happen with the church. The church, which has been persecuted, a minority, downtrodden through the years, is going to rise up and rule the world ultimately. And we have at least a foreshadowing of that to what happened to the Jewish community. Some of you, if you're Star Trek fans, you may remember in the 4th Star Trek, I believe it was McCoy, who said that the bureaucratic mentality is the one constant in the universe. Well, another constant in the universe is anti-Semitism. And the church, of course, inherits that because we're spiritual Jews. So we inherit that anti-Semitism. I'll look at Esther 3:8 before I go further. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, this is Esther 3:8, There is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. Oh, you see the story here? And I chuckle, but it's not, been anything but humorous over the years. The worst, the most horrific prejudice has been anti-Semitism. There's nothing as intense, nothing as enduring. One great historian of Jewish descent, Bernard Lewis, who recently died, he died, he was almost 100 years old when he died, I believe, and he was an expert on Islam. But he said that anti-Semitism is unique because it is the most intense and the most enduring of prejudices. And as I said, that's transferred now to the church because we are spiritual Jews. Anyway, so he said, we've got to get rid of these people. And the king went along at that point. But as you see later on, things turned around. And it's the enemies of the Jews who were extinguished at this time. And it was a great victory for the Jewish people, and the after effects continued for a while. I think if you read Ezra 7 and Nehemiah, you'll see that the Jews were in relatively good favor in those years, the years of Ezra and Nehemiah, so that a lot could be accomplished because the Persian Empire looked favorably on the Jews. So we do have periods like that at times when things work out in the Jews' favor, and such a period was the time after Esther. But let's see how things dramatically turned around at the time of Esther. I want to go to Esther 8 and verse 15. So here now Haman's decree to destroy all the Jews has been invalidated. Haman is hanged in the book of Esther. His 10 sons are hanged, and then thousands of the Jews' enemies are exterminated. And now Mordecai is advanced. He had saved the king's life. By the way, Ahasuerus was eventually assassinated, but he could have been assassinated earlier. But Mordecai saved him. And Esther, of course, was his queen. So now they are elevated and given great power and influence by Xerxes, Ahasuerus. And so we have a situation somewhat like what we had with Daniel or Joseph. Let's go back to Joseph. Joseph is an Israelite, and yet he's second in command of the Egyptian Empire. He could never run it because he could never be Pharaoh, but he's next best thing. Then we have Daniel, same thing. Being a Jew, he's not going to run the Chaldean Empire, but he's the next best thing. Now we have Mordecai and Esther, and they're again they're not going to run the Medo-Persian Empire, but again they're the next best thing. So I go now to Esther 8 in verse 15. So Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, with a great crown of gold, and a garment of fine linen and purple, and the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. So evidently, even though they were down on the Jews, they were not particularly fond of Haman, it would seem. Haman was not very popular. Or it may be that they're talking particularly of the Jews in Shushan and those who had a sense of decency, didn't want to go along with this genocide. Maybe it's a matter of the decent people of Shushan rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness, joy and honor. This verse is recited by Orthodox Jews every Saturday night. Positive beginning to the week. Let's go to Esther 8:17. And in every province and city, wherever the king's command and decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a holiday. Then many of the people of the land became Jews, because fear of the Jews fell upon them. So there evidently were mass conversions at this time, and it pictures, ultimately, the conversion of humanity to God's way of life. Now, on the other hand, some people read this, that many people, in effect, pretended to be Jews. They wanted to be thought of as Jews, because now it was chic. It was the in thing to be Jewish. And, so that could be as well. But it still foreshadows a time when it will be the in thing to be in God's church. That's not the situation now, but it will be. So now we come to the 9th chapter of the book of Esther, and I'll just read because we're in the 12th month. This is the second day of the 12th month as I give this talk. Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day, the time came for the king's command and his decree to be executed. On the day that the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred. We had a complete reversal of fortunes. A complete reversal. Excuse me. On the day that the enemies of the Jews, had hoped to overpower them, the opposite occurred, in that the Jews themselves overpowered those who hated them. The Jews gathered together in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm, and no one could withstand them, because fear of them fell upon all people. And all the officials of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and all those doing the king's work helped the Jews, because the fear of Mordecai fell upon them. So as I said, now the power of the state was behind the church rather than oppressing the church. For Mordecai was great in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces, for this man Mordecai became increasingly prominent. Thus the Jews defeated all their enemies with the stroke of the sword, with slaughter and destruction, and did that which pleased those who did that, and did what they pleased, to those who hated them. Victory. Victory. Some of you remember those high school days? Victory, victory, that's our cry. Victory. So anyway, but I don't want to be frivolous. Purim is a frivolous time because it's such a relief, and Purim is the most frivolous of holidays among the Jews. But anyway, this is so critically important that the Jews were given this great victory, and Super Jew is ultimately coming. The King of Kings and Lord of Lords, Jesus Christ, who as a human being, was and is Jewish, and he's coming to rule over the world, and he's going to conquer those who oppose him. Excuse me, you can read about that in many places, but I'm thinking particularly of Revelation 19. Now I want to go a little further as we get towards the end of the book. We do find that a festival, the Jews decided to, that they would commit themselves to observe a festival in commemoration of what occurred. Fasting is mentioned as well, and Orthodox Jews fast the day before Purim. I want to go to verse 30 of Esther 9. I'll start in verse 29. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai the Jew, wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter about Purim. And Mordecai sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus with words of peace and truth. So here we have a major section of the world, and a major section of the world known to people of that time that is being influenced to be sympathetic to the Jews, and most of the Jews of the world lived in that area, and now had been rescued from extermination, and in fact had exterminated their enemies, and were now favored highly in that empire. To confirm these days of Purim at their appointed time, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had prescribed for them, and as they had decreed for themselves and their descendants concerning matters of their fasting and lamenting. And so their fasting and lamenting was heard by God, and he reversed Haman's decree. So the decree of Esther confirmed these matters of Purim, and it was written in the book. And so at the end of the account, let's understand, the Jews are still in effect a subjugated people under the Medo-Persian Empire, but they have it about as good as they're going to have it until the Messianic age. So it's a foreshadowing of their ultimate victory. Verse 3 of Esther 10. Esther 10:3. For Mordecai the Jew was second to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews, and well received by the multitude of his brethren, seeking the good of his people, and speaking peace to all his countrymen. So what we see here is a month before the New Testament Passover, on the 14th day of the 12th month, a month before the New Testament Passover, we have the historic event of the keeping of the first Purim back in 473 BC. And so we do see this as a foreshadowing of the victory of God's people and the rule of Jesus Christ and the saints. And it is a motivator. Reading this book then gives us a positive frame of mind to then be self-examining for a month. Obviously, we should be doing it, on a regular basis, but at least for the next month, we're self-examining and preparing to take the Lord's Supper, the New Testament Passover. Some call it communion. I like the term Eucharist because, Jesus Christ thanked God when he ate. He thanked God for the food, and so it's Eucharisto in Greek, Eucharist. I like that term, but the Bible uses the term Lord's Supper or New Testament or Passover. So I use those terms. It's the New Testament Passover or the Lord's Supper. And I want to go to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15. So we have this historic event to remind us of what's coming. There is an ultimate victory that is coming. And so Esther and Mordecai motivate us a month before the days, the Passover and the days of unleavened bread, to remember that we need to stick with God and his people because God is the winner. And those who stick with him are winners. I want to go to 1 Corinthians 15. 1 Corinthians 15 and verse 57. 1 Corinthians 15, 57. But thanks be to God, who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ. So, as we come to the winter, we come to the end of the ecclesiastical year, and we come to the time of the events of the book of Esther. We have Esther and Mordecai and motivation to self-examine before the days of unleavened bread. The Esther and Mordecai motivation. All the best to you and yours.